There's a specific kind of cold that doesn't just numb your skin, it hollows out your bones. That was the cold gripping the city the day a 14-year-old street kid named Toby threw himself into a black freezing reservoir. He didn't jump for glory or redemption. He jumped because an 8-year-old girl was sinking beneath the ice and nobody else was looking. He pulled her out, trading his last breath for hers. He didn't know she belonged to a Hell's Angels enforcer. He didn't know his anonymous invisible life was about to violently collide with 169 outlaws. The city didn't care if he froze. It just kept moving. Toby sat on a stolen milk crate under the overpass, his knees pulled tight to his chest. He was 14, but malnutrition and 3 winters on the concrete had stunted him, leaving him looking closer to 11. He wore a heavy canvas coat that had once belonged to a grown man. The cuffs were rolled back 3 times, and the seams were sealed with strips of silver duct tape. It smelled like damp wool and stale exhaust. February was always the worst month. The snow wasn't white anymore. It was a hardened, abrasive sludge that piled up against the gutters, stained black by tires and oil. Beyond the overpass sat Miller's Pond, a sprawling man-made reservoir that bordered the city park. The water had frozen solid right after New Year's, locking the surface in a thick layer of opaque white ice. But a recent deceptive thaw had weakened the center, leaving it rotten. Toby watched his own breath pluming in the gray air. He was hungry. It wasn't the sharp, stabbing hunger of a skipped meal. It was the dull, heavy ache of a stomach that had forgotten how to be full. He chewed on the inside of his cheek, watching the park across the street. It was empty, save for the wind pushing dead leaves across the frozen grass. Then, the low, guttural rumble of heavy machinery broke the quiet. 3 motorcycles pulled into the gravel lot on the far side of the reservoir. They weren't sport bikes. They were heavy, modified Harley-Davidsons, their chrome dull under the overcast sky. The men who cut the engines were massive, swathed in thick leather and heavy denim. Even from 100 yards away, Toby could see the stark, unmistakable patches on their backs. Hell's Angels. Toby shrank back into the shadow of the concrete pillar. Rule number 1 of surviving the streets: never let the predators see you looking. The lead rider kicked his stand down and dismounted. His name was Daniel. He was a mountain of a man with a thick graying beard and a jawline that looked like it had been broken and reset half a dozen times. He reached back to the passenger pillion and lifted a small shape into the air, setting it down on the gravel. It was a little girl. She couldn't have been older than 8. She wore a bright, obnoxious pink snowsuit that stood out against the drab industrial background like a flare. A white knit beanie with a massive pom-pom swallowed the top half of her head. Daniel crouched down, pointing a thick leather-gloved finger at her chest, speaking words Toby couldn't hear over the wind. The girl nodded vigorously. Daniel patted her helmeted head, stood up, and turned to the other 2 bikers. They lit cigarettes, their postures shifting into a tense, huddled conversation. Business. The girl, left to her own devices, began to kick at the gravel. She found a flat stone and tossed it. It skittered across the asphalt and hit the edge of the frozen reservoir. She followed it. Toby watched her. His chest tightened. "Don't go on the ice," he thought. "It's rotten." The girl stepped off the gravel and onto the frozen surface. The ice near the shore was thick, supported by the shallow mud beneath. She slid her boots across the surface, laughing at a joke only she could hear. She took another step, then another. Daniel had his back turned. He was pointing toward a rusted warehouse across the street, arguing with the rider to his left. The wind was picking up, howling through the steel girders of the overpass, drowning out the sound of the girl's boots scraping against the ice. She was 15 yards out now. The ice here wasn't white anymore. It was a dark, bruised blue. That meant deep water. That meant thin ice. Toby stood up. The milk crate scraped against the concrete. "Hey!" Toby muttered, his voice raspy from disuse. He swallowed hard. "Hey!" The wind swallowed the sound completely. The girl saw something in the ice, a frozen fish maybe, or a trapped leaf. She dropped to her knees to get a better look, Crack. It wasn't a loud noise. It didn't sound like a gunshot or a breaking board. It sounded like the low, hollow groan of a settling house. But Toby knew that sound. He had seen a stray dog go through the ice 2 winters ago. The memory of the animal's frantic, useless splashing was permanently burned into his retinas. The girl froze. She looked down at her knees. Spiderwebs of white fracture lines were shooting out in every direction from where she rested. She looked back toward her father. Daniel was still facing the other way, taking a drag from his cigarette. "Dad?" she called out. It was a thin, reedy sound. Toby didn't think. He didn't weigh the pros and cons. He didn't consider the fact that he was a 90-pound street kid with a chest infection, or that the men on the shore were hardened criminals who wouldn't hesitate to break his jaw if he came too close to their property. He just started running. He sprinted out from under the overpass, his worn sneakers slipping on the slush-covered asphalt. He scrambled over the low aluminum guardrail and hit the gravel lot. Out on the ice, the girl tried to stand up. The shift in her weight was the final straw. The ice gave way. It didn't shatter. It simply folded inward. The girl dropped straight down into the black water. The bright pink of her snowsuit vanished in a fraction of a second, swallowed by the reservoir. She didn't even have time to scream. Daniel didn't hear the ice break. He heard the splash. The massive biker spun around, dropping a cigarette. For a split second, his brain refused to process the empty expanse of ice where his daughter had just been. Then, he saw the jagged black hole in the center of the reservoir. "Lily!" Daniel roared. It was a sound torn from the absolute bottom of his lungs, raw and primal. He lunged toward the shoreline, his heavy leather boots slipping violently on the frozen gravel. The 2 other bikers bolted after him. But they were 50 yards away, weighed down by heavy gear and panic. Toby was already on the ice. He was light. That was his only advantage. He didn't run. He slid, dropping to his hands and knees to distribute his weight as he hit the blue ice. The cold immediately seeped through his thin jeans, biting into his kneecaps. He reached the edge of the hole. The water was churning, thick with broken shards of ice. Lily broke the surface. Her face was stark white, her eyes wide with a terror so absolute it looked like madness. She was thrashing wildly, her small hands clawing at the slick edge of the ice, but her snowsuit, designed to keep her warm, was now a saturated anchor pulling her down. "Grab my hand!" Toby screamed, sliding forward on his belly. Lily couldn't hear him. The shock of the freezing water was paralyzing her lungs. She slipped under again. Toby scrambled to the very edge. The ice beneath his chest groaned, bowing under his weight. He plunged his arm into the water. The cold was a physical blow. It felt like 1,000 burning needles driving straight to the bone. He swept his arm blindly, feeling nothing but freezing water and sharp ice chunks. He couldn't reach her. She was sinking. "If I go in, I don't come out," Toby's brain screamed. He knew the math. The street had taught him exactly how fragile a human body was. He looked back. Daniel was 20 yards away, running onto the ice, but the heavy man's footfalls were already causing the surface to fracture violently. "Stay back!" Toby shrieked at the biker. "You'll break the whole thing!" Daniel didn't stop. He was a father watching his child die. He took another step, and the ice beneath him shattered. The massive man pitched forward, plunging into the shallow water near the shore, roaring in frustration as the heavy mud trapped his boots. There was no more time. Toby stripped off his heavy canvas coat. The wind immediately bit into his thin t-shirt. He took one deep, ragged breath. He slid head first into the black water. The impact knocked the breath completely out of him. The cold didn't feel like a temperature. It felt like a vice crushing his ribs. His vision narrowed to a pinpoint. The water under the ice was a murky, terrifying twilight. He forced his eyes open. The salt from the road runoff stung his corneas. He looked down into the gloom. He saw a blur of bright pink, 5 feet down and drifting sideways under the solid ice. The current from the reservoir's outflow was pulling her away from the hole. Toby kicked his legs, fighting the buoyancy of the trapped air in his clothes. He reached down, extending his fingers as far as they would go. He touched the synthetic fabric of her snowsuit. He dug his fingers in, grabbing a handful of the heavy material. He pulled. It was like trying to lift a boulder. His lungs were burning, screaming for oxygen. The freezing water was rapidly sapping the strength from his muscles. His limbs felt like lead. He kicked harder, using his free hand to stroke upward. They hit the surface. Toby gasped, sucking in freezing air. Lily was entirely limp in his grip. Her lips were a frightening shade of violet. Her eyes rolled back. He grabbed the back of her collar and shoved her upward toward the jagged edge of the ice. "Take her!" Toby screamed. Daniel was chest-deep in the water 10 yards away, furiously smashing through the ice with his bare fists, leaving a trail of blood and broken slabs behind him, trying to reach deep water. "Push!" Daniel bellowed, his voice cracking. Toby shoved the girl onto the solid shelf of ice. Her upper body slid onto the surface, but her legs remained in the water. The edge cracked under the new weight, dipping dangerously. Toby realized he couldn't pull himself up. The cold had done its work. His fingers wouldn't close. His arms hung uselessly at his sides. The current was pulling at his legs, dragging him back under the ice shelf. He looked at Lily. She was safe on the ice, sliding slightly away from the edge as the other 2 bikers crawled forward on their bellies with a length of rope they'd pulled from a saddlebag. Toby let go. He didn't mean to. His body simply shut down. The muscles in his forearms gave out, and he slipped backward into the dark water. The water closed over Toby's head. The burning in his lungs was gone, replaced by a strange, heavy lethargy. The panic faded. The noise of the wind, the shouting bikers, the cracking ice, it all vanished, leaving only a muffled, ringing silence. It wasn't so bad, he thought. It was just dark. Then, something massive and violent crashed into the water next to him. A massive, calloused hand clamped down on the collar of Toby's t-shirt. The grip was inescapable, twisting the fabric so tight it nearly choked him. Daniel had reached the deep water. With a roar that vibrated through the freezing liquid, the giant biker hauled backward. Toby broke the surface like a rag doll. Daniel didn't try to place him on the fragile ice. He simply dragged the boy through the freezing water, using his sheer mass and fury to bulldoze a path through the remaining ice back to the muddy shallows. "I got 'em both!" Daniel roared, his chest heaving as he hit solid ground. He threw Toby onto the frozen gravel lot. The boy hit the ground hard, gasping reflexively. His body was convulsing in violent, uncontrollable spasms. He couldn't feel his hands or feet. His vision was a blurry smear of gray and chrome. 10 feet away, the other 2 bikers had pulled Lily entirely out of the water. One of them, a lanky man with a spiderweb tattoo on his neck, was doing chest compressions. "Come on, kid," the lanky man grunted. "Come on." Daniel dropped to his knees beside his daughter. The terrifying stillness of the giant man was worse than his roaring. He placed 2 massive, trembling fingers against her neck. Lily violently arched her back and vomited reservoir water onto the gravel. She sucked in a massive, ragged breath and immediately began to wail. Daniel collapsed backward into the slush, pulling his soaking, freezing daughter onto his chest, wrapping his massive arms around her. He buried his face in her wet hair, his broad shoulders shaking. Toby watched the scene through half-closed eyes. He wanted to crawl away, to get back to his overpass, but his brain couldn't make his legs move. The violent shivering was beginning to slow down. That was a bad sign. He knew that much. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing rapidly louder. Someone had called it in. Toby closed his eyes. The concrete felt oddly warm now. Hey, kid, keep your eyes open." A heavy leather jacket fell over Toby, smelling of old smoke and gun oil. A scarred, tattooed hand gently slapped his freezing cheek. It was the lanky biker. "Look at me, kid," the biker demanded. "Don't you check out on me." Toby tried to speak, but his jaw was locked tight. An ambulance tore into the gravel lot, its tires locking up as it skidded to a halt. Paramedics spilled out, running toward the group with jump bags and blankets. They swarmed Daniel and Lily first. It made sense. The massive, soaking wet biker and the screaming child in the pink snowsuit were the center of gravity. She was under for maybe 30 seconds. Daniel was yelling at the medics, his voice frantic. "She's freezing! Get her in the rig!" A medic turned to the lanky biker kneeling over Toby. "Who's the kid?" "He's the one who went in," the biker said, his voice deadly quiet. "He pulled her up before Daniel got there." The medic looked down at Toby. The boy was gray. His lips were blue, his skin mottled. "Get a backboard now!" the medic shouted to his partner. They loaded Toby into the second ambulance. The interior was blindingly bright. The medics cut off his soaking clothes. Toby didn't care. He was drifting away from his own body. He felt the prick of an IV needle, felt the agonizing burn of warmed saline pushing into his frozen veins. "Heart rate is dropping," a voice said above him. "Temp is 89 degrees and falling. He's bradycardic." "Push epi, call County General, tell them we have a severe hypothermia protocol." Toby wanted to tell them it was okay. He didn't have insurance. He didn't have a mom to call. They were wasting the good medicine on him. He opened his mouth, but only a faint wheeze escaped. The last thing Toby saw before the darkness took him completely was the ambulance doors closing, shutting out the gray February sky. 4 hours later, County General Hospital smelled like bleach and old coffee. Daniel sat in a plastic chair in the pediatric ICU waiting room. He had changed into dry clothes, heavy work boots, black denim, and his leather cut with the winged death's head on the back. His hair was still damp. A doctor in blue scrubs pushed through the double doors. Daniel stood up. The massive biker towered over the physician. "Your daughter is going to be fine," the doctor said quickly, reading the danger in the room. "Her core temperature is back to normal. No signs of secondary drowning. We're keeping her overnight for observation, but she's asking for you." Daniel closed his eyes. A long, shuddering breath escaped his chest. The tension that had been holding his spine rigid finally broke. "Can I see her?" Daniel asked, his voice rough. "In a moment. First, I need to ask you about the other boy, the one who came in the second bus." Daniel frowned. In the absolute chaos of the moment, the panic over Lily had eclipsed everything else. He remembered the blur of a kid sliding on the ice, the small hands pushing Lily up just as he smashed through the water. "Where is he?" Daniel asked. "He's in the ICU," the doctor said, his expression grim. "He took the brunt of the cold. His heart stopped in the ER. We had to use the paddles to bring him back. He's stabilized, but he's unconscious." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Who are his folks? Are they here?" The doctor sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "He doesn't have any. The police ran his prints from a minor shoplifting charge 2 years ago. His name is Toby. He's a documented runaway, state ward. He's been living on the streets." Daniel stared at the doctor. The words hit him harder than a crowbar. A street kid, a throwaway, a kid who had absolutely nothing in the world had thrown himself into a freezing reservoir to save a stranger's child, knowing it would likely kill him. "The social worker is on her way," the doctor continued. "Once he's cleared, he'll likely be transferred to a juvenile holding facility until they can place him in a group home." Daniel didn't say anything. He just looked past the doctor, staring at the sterile white walls of the hospital corridor. "Hold him here," Daniel said quietly. "Excuse me?" the doctor asked. I said, "Hold him here. Don't let any social worker put him in a holding cell." Daniel stepped closer to the doctor. He didn't raise his voice, but the threat was implicit and absolute. "That kid stays in the best room in this hospital until I say otherwise." "Sir, you have no legal authority." Daniel pulled a heavy matte black smartphone from his pocket. He turned away from the doctor and dialed a number. "Yeah, it's Daniel," he said into the phone. "Lily's good. Yeah, listen to me. Get word to the chapter. Call the Southside Boys. Call the Nomads. I need everyone at County General." Daniel paused, listening to the voice on the other end. "No," Daniel replied, his eyes narrowing. "Not just a few guys, everyone." He hung up the phone and looked back at the doctor. "I don't care about legal authority," Daniel said. That kid gave his life for my blood. He's not leaving this hospital alone. The ICU was designed to be a vacuum. It was a place stripped of the outside world, governed entirely by the rhythmic electronic chirping of heart monitors and the mechanical hiss of ventilators. Time didn't exist here. There was only the steady drip of IV fluids and the hushed rubber-soled footsteps of nurses moving between beds. Toby lay in room 412, a frail mound beneath a stack of heated thermal blankets. He looked entirely swallowed by the sterile environment. The medical staff had cleaned him up, washing the soot and street grime from his skin, revealing just how thin he really was. His collarbones jutted out sharply against his pale skin. Faded, yellowish bruises lined his ribs, the kind of marks you get from sleeping on concrete and taking hits you couldn't dodge. A thick plastic tube fed oxygen into his nostrils, and a tangle of wires connected his chest to the glowing monitor above his head. He was alive, but the violent trauma of the ice water had pushed his battered system to the absolute brink. Outside the hospital walls, the vacuum was about to shatter. It started as a low-frequency vibration. The nurses on the 4th floor felt it in the soles of their shoes before they actually heard it. It felt like a heavy freight train was rolling directly under the foundation of County General. Then came the sound. It was a deep, synchronized roar of combustion engines. It echoed off the concrete parking structures, vibrating the heavy glass of the hospital windows. Patients stirred in their beds. Doctors paused mid-sentence. The head nurse, a 20-year veteran named Sarah, walked to the end of the corridor and peered out the reinforced window overlooking the main entrance. Her breath hitched. They were pouring into the hospital's main loop in a massive, unbroken column of heavy iron and chrome. Dozens of them, then 50, then 100. Motorcycles filled the drop-off lanes, the visitor parking, and the grassy medians. They parked in tight, disciplined rows. Men cut their engines in rolling waves, the sudden silence almost as deafening as the noise had been. These weren't weekend riders. They wore heavy, road-worn leather cuts over thick hoodies and flannel. The winged death's head of the Hells Angels was emblazoned on every back, accompanied by bottom rockers denoting chapters from 3 different surrounding counties. 169 patched members had answered Daniel's call. Hospital security, a couple of retired cops in ill-fitting blazers, stepped out through the sliding glass doors, their hands hovering nervously near their radios. 2 city patrol cars, drawn by the massive influx of heavy bikes, pulled up to the edge of the lot, but the officers inside didn't get out. They simply watched. You didn't antagonize a heavily organized club of this size without a SWAT team, and a very good reason. Down in the lot, a man with a thick iron-gray beard and a president's patch dismounted his road glide. His name was Clay. He walked to the front of the pack, pulling off his heavy leather gauntlets. The other men fell in behind him, a silent, imposing army of denim and leather. They walked through the sliding glass doors of County General. The lobby, usually a chaotic mix of crying children and stressed families, went dead silent. The receptionist stopped typing. A janitor froze with his mop. Clay walked straight to the main desk, flanked by 4 massive sergeants at arms. "We're here for Daniel," Clay said. His voice was a gravelly baritone that didn't ask for permission. "And we're here for the kid." Up on the 4th floor, the elevator doors chimed and slid open. Daniel stepped out first. He'd spent the last hour sitting beside Lily's bed in the pediatric wing. She was asleep, her color back to normal, her tiny hand clutching a stuffed bear a nurse had found for her. Knowing she was safe had finally allowed the adrenaline to bleed out of Daniel's system. What replaced it was a cold, calculated focus. He walked down the hall toward room 412. Sarah, the head nurse, stepped out from behind the station to block his path. "Sir, this is the intensive care unit," she said firmly, though her eyes darted to the heavy patch on his back. "Family only." "I am his family," Daniel said. He didn't blink. He didn't raise his voice. He just kept walking. Sarah, reading the immovable resolve in the giant man's posture, stepped aside. Daniel entered the room and stopped at the foot of the bed. Seeing Toby in the street, covered in slush and fighting for his life, had been one thing. Seeing him here, scrubbed clean and hooked up to machines, was entirely different. Daniel looked at the boy's hands. They were small, the knuckles raw and scarred from the cold. He looked at the hollowed-out cheeks. This kid had nothing, no heat, no food, no parents to protect him. Every day of his life was a fight for simple survival. Yet, when a stranger's kid went through the ice, this starving street rat hadn't hesitated to throw away the only thing he owned, his life. The door clicked open. Clay stepped into the room, followed by two other patched members. The room instantly felt claustrophobic. "Daniel," Clay nodded, his eyes scanning the frail boy in the bed. "He saved her, Clay," Daniel said softly, not taking his eyes off Toby. "I was too far out. I was too heavy. I broke the ice and couldn't reach her. This kid, he went under. He pulled her up. He gave out so she wouldn't fall back in." Clay crossed his massive arms over his chest. He looked at the steady rhythm of the heart monitor, then down at Toby's battered face. In the outlaw world, currency wasn't money. It was blood, respect, and debt. What this boy had done was a debt that could never be fully repaid. It was a blood tie, forged in the freezing water of Miller's Pond. "Where are his people?" Clay asked. "He's a state ward," Daniel replied, his jaw tightening. "A runaway. Doctor said they're calling child services to come collect him once he wakes up, put him back in the system." Clay let out a slow, derisive breath through his nose. He knew the system. Most of the men in the lobby knew the system. It was a meat grinder that chewed up kids like Toby and spit them out into prisons or early graves. "No," Clay said simply. The single word carried the weight of a judge's gavel. He turned to the two men at the door. "Set a detail. 2 men on this door, 24/7. 2 at the elevators, 2 in the lobby. Nobody comes in here unless they have a stethoscope or a patch. If some suit with a clipboard shows up, you tell them the club is claiming this room." "Done, boss," one of the men grunted, stepping out into the hall. Daniel pulled a plastic chair to the side of the bed and sat down. The chair groaned under his weight. He rested his massive calloused forearms on his knees, leaning forward. "You sleep, kid," Daniel muttered to the unconscious boy. "Nobody's touching you now. You're surrounded." The bureaucratic machine of the state moved slowly, but it always moved. At 9 a.m. the following morning, a woman named Brenda Higgins stepped off the elevator onto the 4th floor. Brenda was 50, chronically exhausted, and underpaid. She carried a battered plastic clipboard and a heavy canvas tote bag stuffed with case files. She had been a social worker for 15 years, which meant she had lost her optimism about a decade ago. Her assignment was straightforward: retrieve the John Doe runaway designated Toby, assess his medical clearance, and arrange for a police transport to the county juvenile holding center until a bed opened up in a group home. It was standard procedure. She walked toward the nurse's station, keeping her head down, flipping through the thin file. She stopped dead in her tracks. Standing in front of the door to room 412 were 2 men who looked like they belonged on a cell block rather than a hospital ward. They were massive, heavily tattooed, and wearing leather cuts over black hoodies. They stood with their arms crossed, staring directly at her with blank, dead-eyed expressions. Brenda looked around. The ICU, normally a quiet haven of medical routine, felt entirely different. Down the hall near the waiting room, 4 more bikers were sitting in the plastic chairs, quietly drinking coffee from styrofoam cups. She walked up to the nurse's station. Sarah was reviewing a chart. "Excuse me," Brenda said, keeping her voice low. "I'm with the Department of Child and Family Services. I'm here for the minor in 412. Who are these men?" Sarah looked up, an expression of profound weariness on her face. "They're his guests. They've been here all night. More of them downstairs. The police came by at midnight, talked to their president, and decided it wasn't worth a riot to clear them out." Brenda frowned, her bureaucratic instincts overriding her common sense. She squared her shoulders, adjusted her glasses, and marched toward room 412. As she approached, the two bikers at the door didn't move. They simply shifted their weight, effectively forming a solid wall of muscle and leather across the door frame. "Excuse me," Brenda said, adopting her sternest official voice. "I am a state social worker. I need to see the patient." The biker on the left, a man with a scarred eyebrow and the name Grizz tattooed across his knuckles, looked down at her. "He's resting. No visitors." "I'm not a visitor," Brenda snapped, tapping her clipboard. "I am his state-appointed guardian. He is a ward of the state, and he is going into my custody today." The door behind them opened. Daniel stepped out. He looked even more imposing today. The dark circles under his eyes spoke of a sleepless night, but his posture was rigid, crackling with violent energy. He looked from Brenda to the clipboard, instantly understanding exactly what she was. "Can I help you?" Daniel asked. His voice was a low rumble. "I'm Brenda Higgins, DCFS. I'm here to take custody of the boy, Toby. Once he is medically cleared, he's being transferred to the Juvenile Transit Center." Daniel stepped fully into the hallway, forcing Brenda to take a half step back. "He's not going to a transit center. He's not going to a group home. He's staying right here." "Sir, you have absolutely no legal standing," Brenda said, her voice rising in frustration. "You are not family. You are not his legal guardian. If you obstruct a state worker, I will have the police arrest you." "The cops downstairs?" Daniel asked, a cynical smirk touching the corner of his mouth. "The ones who have been sitting in their cruisers for 12 hours avoiding eye contact with us? Call 'em." Brenda flushed red. "This boy belongs to the state." "This boy doesn't belong to anybody," Daniel countered, his voice dropping an octave, losing all traces of amusement. "The state left him to freeze under a highway overpass. The state let him starve. Where were you yesterday, Brenda, when he was eating out of a garbage can? Where was his state-appointed guardian when he jumped into a frozen lake to save my daughter's life?" Brenda opened her mouth, but no words came out. "You didn't give a damn about him until he ended up on a piece of paperwork," Daniel continued, stepping closer. "He died in that ambulance yesterday. His heart stopped. He traded his life for my little girl's. So let me make this crystal clear for you and whatever broken bureaucracy you work for. The state's claim on him expired the second he hit that ice." A man in a sharp, tailored charcoal suit walked down the hallway, effortlessly weaving past the bikers in the waiting area. He carried a sleek leather briefcase. His name was Frank, and he was the club's retainer attorney. He cost $700 an hour, and he was worth every penny. Frank approached the standoff, smiling smoothly at Brenda. "Ms. Higgins, I presume?" Frank asked, extending a manicured hand. Brenda didn't take it. Frank smoothly withdrew his hand and popped open his briefcase. "I'm Frank Reynolds, legal counsel for Mr. Daniel here, and by extension, the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club," Frank said briskly. "I have here a stack of injunctions filed at 8 a.m. this morning with the county judge. We are officially petitioning for emergency medical guardianship of the minor known as Toby, citing egregious neglect by the state apparatus." Brenda stared at the paperwork Frank shoved over her clipboard. "You can't do this. A judge won't give a motorcycle club custody of a child." "Perhaps not permanently," Frank smiled, the expression cold and predatory. "But these injunctions mandate that the child cannot be moved, transferred, or processed by DCFS until a full judicial hearing is conducted. That hearing is scheduled for 6 weeks from now. In the meantime, the court has granted temporary medical proxy to my client, as he is the sole party willing to cover the exorbitant private medical costs the state hospital refuses to absorb." Frank tapped the paper. "Check the signature, Brenda. Judge Harrison signed it himself. If you try to move that boy, you'll be the one in contempt of court." Brenda looked at the signature. She looked at the expensive lawyer, the two massive guards at the door, and finally at Daniel. She realized, with a sinking feeling in her stomach, that she was completely outmatched. The state relied on apathy and lack of resources to process its wards. It had no defense against a heavily funded, aggressively organized machine that actively pushed back. She lowered her clipboard. He needs follow-up care, psychiatric evaluation. He needs a stable environment. He's got a private room at the best recovery clinic in the city waiting for him when he leaves here, Daniel said quietly. Fully paid for. He's going to eat 3 hot meals a day. He's going to sleep in a warm bed, and nobody is ever going to lay a hand on him again. Brenda looked at the door to room 412, then back to Daniel. She let out a long, defeated sigh. She turned around and walked back toward the elevators, her footsteps heavy on the linoleum. Daniel watched her go. He turned back to the room. The door opened and one of the nurses rushed past him. "He's waking up," she said. Consciousness didn't return all at once. It bled into the darkness, a slow, agonizing leak of sound and pain. First came the rhythmic, high-pitched beep of the heart monitor. Then, the smell. It was a sharp chemical odor, bleach, rubbing alcohol, and the distinct sterile scent of clean linens. Toby's brain categorized the smell instantly. Hospital. His eyes snapped open. The harsh fluorescent light directly above the bed felt like a physical blow. He squinted, his vision swimming in a blurred wash of white ceiling tiles. His throat was a desert. When he tried to swallow, it felt like his esophagus was lined with crushed glass. Then, the panic hit. The street survival instincts that had kept him alive for 3 years slammed into his nervous system. Hospitals meant questions. Questions meant cops. Cops meant the juvenile holding center. Toby threw his arms out, trying to push himself up. His right hand jerked violently, stopped by a tangle of plastic tubing. He looked down. An IV needle was taped securely to the back of his bruised hand. A thick plastic clip clamped his left index finger. "Get out! Move!" He reached across his body with his free hand and grabbed the IV line, his fingers clumsy and weak. He prepared to rip the needle out of his vein. A shadow fell over the bed, eclipsing the fluorescent light. A hand the size of a dinner plate gently but immovably closed over Toby's wrists. The grip wasn't punishing, but it was absolute. It felt like being caught in a velvet vice. "Don't do that," a voice rumbled. It was deep, scraping the bottom of a heavy chest. Toby froze. His eyes darted up, adjusting to the shadow. The man standing over him was a giant. He had a thick graying beard and eyes that looked like they had seen the absolute worst the world had to offer. He wore a heavy black hoodie underneath a leather vest. The vest was covered in patches. The one on the left breast read, "Enforcer." Toby stopped fighting the grip. He knew the patches. Everyone on the street knew the patches. You didn't look at them. You didn't talk to them. You stayed out of their way. I don't have money," Toby rasped. His voice sounded like it was coming from a broken radio. "I didn't steal nothing. I just fell." Daniel let go of the boy's wrists. He slowly pulled a plastic chair closer to the bed and sat down. The chair groaned in protest. Daniel leaned forward, resting his heavy forearms on his knees, putting himself at eye level with the terrified kid. "Nobody's asking for money, kid," Daniel said. Toby swallowed hard, wincing. He looked around the room. It was a private suite. The equipment alone was worth more than a neighborhood block. "The cops? Did they call the cops?" "I gotta go. If they run my name—" "The cops aren't coming in here," Daniel interrupted quietly. "The social workers aren't coming in here. The only people outside that door right now are my brothers. You understand?" Toby didn't. His brain was clouded by the drugs and the lingering fog of hypothermia. He looked at Daniel, then down at his own hands, trying to piece together the shattered fragments of his memory. The cold, the overpass, the gravel lot, the pink snowsuit. Toby's heart rate spiked, the monitor above him increasing its tempo. The little girl in the ice." Daniel's expression shifted. The hard, violent lines around his eyes softened, just for a fraction of a second. The giant man reached out and carefully placed his calloused hand over Toby's small, bruised knuckles. "She's safe," Daniel said. His voice was thick. He cleared his throat. "She's down the hall, sleeping, not a scratch on her." Toby let his head fall back against the pillow. A massive, shuddering breath escaped his lungs. "Okay, good. The ice was rotten. I tried to yell." I know," Daniel said. "I wasn't watching her. I turned my back. By the time I hit the water, you already had her up." Daniel looked at the boy. He saw the defensive posture, the hyper-vigilance, the way Toby's eyes constantly scanned the room for an exit. This was a kid who expected every interaction to end in violence or betrayal. "Why'd you do it, Toby?" Daniel asked. Toby frowned. The question confused him. "She was sinking." "You don't know us," Daniel pushed gently. "You're living under a bridge. You're starving. You had every reason in the world to look the other way. You knew going into that water was a death sentence. Why did you jump?" Toby looked away, staring at the blank white wall. He thought about it. He didn't have a noble answer. He wasn't trying to be a hero. "Because nobody looked for me," Toby whispered, his voice cracking. "When I fell out here, nobody looked. I didn't want her to be cold alone." Daniel closed his eyes. The absolute brutal honesty of the statement hit him like a physical blow. This boy hadn't jumped out of bravery. He had jumped out of empathy, a profound, tragic empathy born from his own abandonment. Daniel stood up. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy gold medallion on a thick chain. It bore the winged death's head of the club. He set it on the nightstand next to the bed. "You listen to me, Toby," Daniel said, leaning over the bed. The gentle tone was gone, replaced by a fierce, terrifying sincerity. "You are never going to be cold alone again. You hear me? Never again. You sleep, you eat, you get your strength back. We hold the door." Toby watched the giant man walk toward the door. For the first time in 3 years, the knot of permanent anxiety in his stomach loosened just a fraction. He closed his eyes, and the darkness took him again. But this time, it was warm. By the 4th day, the 4th floor of County General had adapted to its new reality. The nurses no longer flinched when they walked past the massive leather-clad men guarding room 412. They realized quickly that the bikers were aggressively polite to the medical staff. They stayed out of the way of the crash carts, they held doors open, and they never raised their voices at the nurses. The hospital's cafeteria even saw a massive spike in revenue, courtesy of 169 men eating their weight in terrible meatloaf and black coffee. Inside room 412, Toby was experiencing a terrifying new phenomenon: comfort. He was sitting up in bed, a hospital tray across his lap. On the tray was a double cheeseburger, a mountain of fries, and a massive chocolate milkshake. A biker named Grizz, a man with a scarred scalp and hands the size of cinder blocks, was sitting in the corner reading a worn paperback novel. Grizz had specifically ordered the food from a diner down the street, refusing to let Toby eat the hospital slop. Toby took a bite of the burger. His stomach, shrunken from years of scavenging, protested the heavy grease, but he forced it down. He couldn't leave food on a plate. It violated every survival instinct he possessed. The door clicked open. Daniel walked in. He wasn't alone. Peeking out from behind his massive leather cut was a small face. Lily stepped into the room. She wasn't wearing the pink snowsuit. She wore denim overalls and a bright yellow sweater. She looked entirely out of place in the sterile, terrifying ICU, a tiny splash of color in a gray room. Toby stopped chewing. He suddenly felt incredibly self-conscious. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, acutely aware of how thin and bruised he looked in the hospital gown. Daniel nudged his daughter forward gently. Lily walked up to the edge of the bed. She looked at the tubes running into Toby's arm, then up at his face. Her eyes were wide, taking in the reality of the boy who had pulled her out of the black water. She didn't say anything at first. She just reached into the pocket of her overalls and pulled out a folded piece of construction paper. She held it out to him. Toby hesitated, then took it with his free hand. He unfolded it. It was a drawing done in heavy crayon. It showed a blue circle, the pond. Inside the blue circle was a small pink stick figure. Reaching down from the top of the page was a large, jagged brown shape, gripping the pink figure. At the top of the paper, written in clumsy, blocky letters, were the words, "Thank you, Toby." Toby stared at the paper. His throat tightened painfully. Nobody had ever thanked him for anything. Nobody had ever bothered to learn his name, let alone write it down. "You dropped your coat," Lily said quietly. Her voice was tiny, a stark contrast to the low rumbles Toby had been hearing from the bikers all week. "When you jumped in, you left your coat on the ice." "It's okay," Toby rasped. "It had holes in it anyway." "My dad bought you a new one," she said, pointing a small finger at Daniel. Daniel cleared his throat, looking slightly uncomfortable. "It's in the closet. Fits better than the canvas rag you were wearing." Lily reached out and touched the edge of Toby's blanket. "Are you going to die?" "Lily," Daniel warned softly. "No," Toby said quickly, looking directly at the little girl. "No, I'm not going to die. I'm just thawing out." Lily nodded, satisfied with the answer. She turned and walked back to her father, wrapping her small arms around his massive leg. Daniel put a hand on her head. "Clay's outside," Daniel said to Toby. "He wants a word." Toby nodded. Daniel and Lily left the room. Grizz closed his paperback, stood up, and followed them out, closing the door quietly behind him. A moment later, the door opened again. Clay, the president of the chapter, walked in. He didn't have Daniel's raw, explosive presence. Clay was a different kind of terrifying. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace. His eyes were cold and calculating, the eyes of a man who ran a multi-county criminal enterprise with ruthless efficiency. He pulled up the chair and sat down. Clay didn't speak immediately. He looked at Toby, evaluating him. He looked at the bruised face, the hollow collarbones, the defensive posture. "You know what a ledger is, Toby?" Clay asked finally. Toby shook his head slowly. "It's a book. It tracks what comes in and what goes out," Clay explained, resting his hands on his knees. "Debts and payments. In my world, the ledger is everything. You borrow, you pay back, you take, you give. If the ledger gets unbalanced, people bleed. You follow?" "Yes," Toby said. "The state system, the one you ran away from, their ledger is broken," Clay continued, his voice devoid of emotion. "They take kids like you, file the paperwork, and collect the budget. They don't give anything back. They let you rot. That's why you were sleeping in the dirt." Clay leaned forward. "My club doesn't operate like that. We keep our ledger perfectly balanced. Blood for blood, life for life." Clay pointed a thick finger at Toby's chest. "You gave us a life. Daniel's blood is our blood. You kept his kid breathing at the cost of your own heart stopping. You put this entire club deep in the red." Toby didn't know what to say. He gripped the edge of the tray. "I don't want anything. I'm not asking for money." "It's not about what you're asking for," Clay said firmly. "It's about what we owe. The lawyers handled the state. You're officially a ward of the hospital right now, with Daniel holding medical proxy. When you walk out of here next week, you aren't going back to the overpass. You aren't going to a group home." Clay stood up. He reached into his cut and pulled out a heavy matte black smartphone. He tossed it onto the bed next to Toby's food tray. "There's one number programmed in there," Clay said. "It goes straight to the clubhouse bar. Someone is always on the stool, day or night. You need a ride, you hit the button. You need food, you hit the button. Somebody gives you a hard time on the street, you hit the button and 10 bikes will be there in 5 minutes." Clay walked to the door and grabbed the handle, pausing to look back at the boy. "You're under the shield now, Toby. You walk in our shadow. Take your time. Heal up. When you're ready, Daniel's going to take you home." Clay walked out, the heavy door clicking shut. Toby sat in the silence of the room. He looked at the untouched milkshake. He looked at the black phone resting on the white sheets. Finally, He looked at the crude crayon drawing in his hand. He pulled his knees up to his chest, resting his chin on his bruised arms. He closed his eyes. For the first time in his life, the silence didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like safety. 2 weeks later, the hospital finally ran out of reasons to keep him. Toby sat on the edge of the mattress. The IV lines were gone, leaving behind small purple bruises in the crooks of his elbows. He was no longer gray. He had put on 6 pounds of actual mass, the hollows of his cheeks filling out just enough to make him look his actual age. On the chair next to the bed sat his new clothes. Daniel had brought them the night before. Heavy denim jeans, a thick gray thermal shirt, a pair of steel-toed boots, and a jacket. It wasn't a club vest, those had to be earned in blood and miles, but a heavy, armored black leather riding jacket. Toby took off the thin hospital gown. He pulled on the thermal shirt. It was warm. He laced up the boots. They felt incredibly heavy, anchoring him to the floor. Then he picked up the jacket. The leather was thick, smelling of dye and oil. He slid his arms into the sleeves and zipped it up. It was a little too big in the shoulders, but it felt like armor. For a kid who had spent 3 years trying to make himself invisible, the weight of the jacket was a revelation. It made him feel solid. The door opened. Grizz stood in the frame. He didn't smile. Bikers like Grizz didn't really smile. They just looked at you with varying degrees of approval. "Time to go, kid," Grizz grunted. Toby nodded. He grabbed the black smartphone Clay had given him off the nightstand and slipped it into his pocket. He didn't have anything else. No bags, no history. Just the clothes on his back and the debt he was owed. He walked out into the corridor. The nurses at the station looked up. Sarah, the head nurse who had watched the standoff with the state worker, offered a small, tired smile. Toby gave her a stiff nod. He didn't know how to say goodbye to people who had kept him alive. He followed Grizz to the elevator. 2 more patched members were waiting inside. They rode down to the lobby in silence. The heavy steel doors slid open. Toby stopped. He had expected Daniel, maybe a car. What he hadn't expected was the sheer scale of the extraction. The hospital parking lot was completely locked down. Over 100 motorcycles sat idling in the drop-off lanes, their exhaust pipes sending thick white plumes into the cold March air. The low, synchronized thrum of the heavy V-twin engines vibrated through the soles of Toby's new boots. The men sitting on the bikes were silent. They weren't revving their engines or making a scene. They were just waiting. A massive, intimidating wall of iron and leather. In the center of the pack sat Daniel. He was straddling a massive black street glide. Behind him, idling smoothly, was a black Ford F250 pickup truck. The back window of the truck was rolled down. Lily was sitting in the back seat, securely strapped in, wearing a bright yellow beanie. She saw Toby and waved frantically. Toby walked through the automatic sliding doors. The cold air hit his face, but the leather jacket deflected the chill instantly. Daniel kicked his stand up. He reached back and patted the passenger pillion behind his saddle. Then he held out a matte black full-face helmet. Toby walked across the concrete. The eyes of 169 outlaws tracked his movement. There was no pity in their stares. There was only absolute, unyielding respect. He took the helmet from Daniel. It was heavy. He pulled it over his head and fastened the chin strap. "Climb on," Daniel said, his voice easily cutting through the rumble of the engines. "Hold the grab rails under the seat. Squeeze your knees against my hips. Don't let go." Toby threw his leg over the wide saddle. He settled into the thick leather, finding the grab rails with his hands. He clamped his legs tight against the giant man in front of him. Daniel raised his left fist in the air. The sound was apocalyptic. 169 heavy engines throttled up simultaneously. The noise hit Toby in the chest like a physical shockwave. He gripped the rails tighter. Daniel dropped his fist, popped the clutch, and the massive bike surged forward. They rolled out of the hospital lot in a tight, disciplined formation. The police cruisers parked down the street simply flashed their lights and blocked the intersection, allowing the massive column to turn onto the main avenue uninterrupted. Nobody wanted to impede the procession. Toby watched the city roll by through the tinted visor of his helmet. The wind tore at his jacket, but he was warm. He felt the immense power of the engine vibrating straight into his bones. 10 minutes into the ride, they took the ramp onto the highway. They merged into the right lane. Up ahead, stretching across the concrete skyline, was the overpass. His overpass. Toby braced himself as they approached it. He saw the rusted chain-link fence. He saw the concrete pillar where he used to sit on his milk crate, shivering, watching the cars go by. He saw the dirty snow banked against the guardrail. They blasted under the concrete span at 70 miles an hour. The shadow of the bridge swallowed them for a fraction of a second, and then they were out, back into the pale sunlight. Toby didn't look back. The bridge was empty. The ghost of the freezing, starving boy who had lived there was gone, washed away in the black water of Miller's Pond. He squeezed his knees tighter against the heavy bike and let the thunder of the pack carry him forward. They rode for 40 minutes, leaving the cramped gray grid of the city behind. The concrete gave way to industrial outskirts, then to stretches of desolate two-lane blacktop lined with dead trees and rusted salvage yards. The pack began to slow. Up ahead, a massive structure loomed at the end of a long gravel driveway. It looked like a cross between a repurposed warehouse and a military bunker. High cinder-block walls topped with razor wire surrounded a massive compound. Heavy steel gates stood wide open, guarded by 2 men with shotguns resting casually over their forearms. This was the chapter clubhouse. It wasn't a home in any traditional sense. It was a fortress. The bikes filed through the gates, the tires crunching loudly over the deep gravel. They parked in neat angled rows. Daniel cut the engine. The sudden silence left Toby's ears ringing. "Welcome home, kid," Daniel said, kicking the stand down. Toby pulled his helmet off. The air smelled of gasoline, burnt wood, and stale beer. He climbed off the bike, his legs shaking slightly from the vibration and the adrenaline. The men dismounted around them. They didn't swarm Toby. They didn't offer hugs or fake smiles. They simply nodded at him as they walked past toward the heavy steel doors of the main building. It was a silent acknowledgement. He was here. He belonged here. Daniel put a heavy hand on Toby's shoulder and steered him toward the entrance. Inside, the clubhouse was massive and dimly lit. A long, scarred mahogany bar ran the length of the left wall. Pool tables sat under low-hanging fluorescent lights. The walls were covered in framed photographs of men who were dead or in prison, alongside engine parts and club banners. It was rough, intimidating, and unapologetically violent. But in the center of the room, a massive wood-burning stove radiated a fierce baking heat. "Kitchen is in the back," Daniel said, walking Toby through the main hall. "Cook's name is Smitty. You want food, you tell Smitty. You don't wait for permission. You don't scavenge. You just ask." Toby nodded, his eyes wide, taking in the chaotic details of the room. Daniel led him toward a heavy wooden staircase in the back corner. They climbed to the second floor, which was lined with a row of solid doors. Daniel stopped at the third door on the right. He turned the handle and pushed it open. "In," Daniel grunted. Toby walked into the room. It was small, maybe 10 by 12 feet. The walls were painted a dull gray. There were no posters, no decorations. But against the far wall sat a heavy, solid oak bed with a thick, brand-new mattress. A dark blue woolen quilt was folded neatly at the foot. A heavy cast-iron radiator hissed quietly under a single barred window. A wooden dresser sat in the corner. It was Spartan. It was perfect. "This is your door," Daniel said, standing in the frame, his massive shoulders taking up most of the space. "It locks from the inside. Nobody comes in unless you open it. Not me, not Clay, nobody." Toby walked over to the bed. He reached out and touched the quilt. The fabric was rough, heavy, and incredibly warm. He looked at the heavy iron radiator, feeling the heat washing over his skin. He had spent 3 years chasing exhaust vents and subway grates just to keep his blood moving. Now he had his own heat. He turned back to look at Daniel. The giant biker leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. "I'm not your dad," Daniel said, his voice flat, devoid of sentimentality. "I don't know how to raise a teenager. I know how to break bones and ride motorcycles, but you gave my daughter back to me, so here's the deal." Daniel pointed a thick finger at Toby. "You're going to go to school. Clay bought a fake birth certificate and a guardianship paper from a guy in Chicago. As far as the state is concerned, you're my nephew. You'll get decent grades. You won't touch dope. You won't steal from the brothers. You do that, and you never have to sleep on concrete again. You understand?" "I understand," Toby said softly. "Good." Daniel pushed himself off the doorframe. He reached out, grabbed the handle, and began to pull the door shut. He paused, leaving it cracked open just an inch. "Kid?" Daniel asked softly. "Yeah?" "You sleep. Nobody's coming for you." The heavy wooden door clicked shut. The deadbolt slid into place with a heavy metallic thud. Toby stood in the center of the room. He listened. Downstairs, he could hear the muffled thumping of a jukebox kicking on. He heard the clack of billiard balls and the deep rumbling laughter of hardened men. It was the sound of outlaws. It was the sound of a criminal syndicate winding down for the night. To Toby, it sounded like a lullaby. He didn't bother taking off his clothes. He just unlaced his heavy boots and set them carefully by the door. He crawled onto the oak bed, pulling the thick blue quilt up to his chin. He stared at the ceiling, feeling the heat from the radiator pressing against the side of his face. For the first time since he was 11 years old, the permanent, sickening knot of fear in his stomach unraveled. He closed his eyes. He didn't dream of the cold. He didn't dream of the black water. He just slept, buried deep inside the impenetrable fortress of the men who owed him everything. Toby's story is a brutal, beautiful reminder that heroes don't always look the part and family isn't always bound by blood. A starving street kid threw away his life to save a stranger, and in return, an army of outlaws became the impenetrable shield he never had. True loyalty and redemption are often found in the darkest, most unexpected places. If you felt the raw power of Toby's sacrifice and the club's unbreakable code, hit the like button, share this story, and subscribe to our channel for more deep, hard-hitting tales of survival and brotherhood.